Indeed. Our topic today, Sean, is the 1941 Hollywood classic Citizen Kane, which people have either seen or heard a lot about, because it is obviously one of, if not the most famous movies ever made. I taught it to my Intro to Cinema class 2 weeks ago from when we're recording this. It was the second movie we watched for the class, and I showed it for a week on narrative form. And I put it there mainly because the textbook I'm teaching from, which is Bordwell and Thompson's Film Art, you might know that if you know film study stuff, has a big breakdown of Citizen Kane there. So I kind of felt like, I was kind of trying to resist it because it's like there's a gravitational pull to Citizen Kane that sometimes you want to get away from and be creative. But then I'm like, no, they should see it. It should be an intro to film movie. It's that kind of good, but also there's a whole chapter for them to read about it here, and I feel like I should use it. And then I showed it, and I will say the thing, Sean, is that this is a movie that I'm always surprised by when I go back to it. I think I always find more in it. I think I always find new contemporary resonances, some obvious ones in this moment in time. Yep. I'm always continually, not shocked, but like reinstills for me like, oh yeah, this might be the best black and white cinematography ever captured, from the fucking great Greg Toland. It's a joy to go back to every time.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it, that word joy, because I do think one of the reasons why we kind of chafe at the notion of like we gotta put the metal #1 greatest movie of all time around the neck of Citizen Kane is I think it saddles it with this reputation that it is this like stiff, unapproachable academic thing that's like not for like the common viewer, that you need to be a person with a film degree to like watch and appreciate it, that is this some sort of like unorthodox, bizarre film. And obviously at the time it used some unorthodox production methods and techniques that were uncommon for the time, and it sort of innovated certain kinds of things, which is one of the reasons why it's obviously like a film school staple. But the thing about this movie is it is like wildly entertaining. Like this time watching it, and I've seen this movie a bunch of times. In fact, I watched it. When did the 4K Blu-ray come out from Criterion, Jonathan?
2021 maybe?
Yeah, so a few years ago. Because that's the last time I watched it before this, because I got it when it came out, and I watched that 4K Blu-ray then. And then, so I watched it again this time. I think this is probably the 6th or maybe 7th movie time I've seen Citizen Kane. I've watched this movie a lot. And this time watching it, I was like committed sitting down to be like, watching it this time, I've seen this movie so many times, I really want to like focus on the production, like looking at the production of it and think about that side of the movie while I'm watching it, because it feels like that would be something to talk about on the podcast. And I got maybe like 15 minutes into the movie being able to watch it that way. And then I slowly like forgot that that's what the thing I was consciously trying to look for, because I just melted into the movie because it's so entertaining. It's incredibly funny throughout. Like, I think the sense of humor in the movie, both in terms of the performances, but also like the way it's shot and edited in some of those scenes. I think it has a lot of really great humor to it. And then obviously it's got just like the really deeply compelling drama of this exploration of this incredible central figure of Charles Foster Kane, who is this like very sort of alien and enigmatic character that you are trying to sort of scratch at. And you feel like you get a bit of a grasp on him, and then he comes out of your fingertips, and you're constantly trying to sort of understand who he is. He's this weird contradiction of a man who is both a man of the people and the richest man on earth, of a man who seems to like be giving so much away and also is hoarding absolutely everything he can get. It's such a great character. And the way of them trying to explore him through the narrative form, which I imagine is like a lot of what your class was looking at, is like the tapestry of how the movie is constructed through these series of interlocking flashbacks to see different aspects of the character. Like, that's just such a perfect frame narrative to explore this kind of figure that in America we are so intimately familiar with, that has dominated what it is to be American for all the 20th century and all the 21st century, of this like weird, monopolistic tycoon businessman, and much of the 19th century as well in America. And it is just like the perfect way to explore that story with like insight and drama and humor. And it is, at the end of the day, just like such a fascinatingly entertaining movie to watch on like a popular movie kind of level, not on a, I'm watching, some super obscure film. Like, it's like Inland Kingdom, it's like, I don't have to fucking I don't need to like
Inland Empire,
watch it.
yeah.
Inland Empire, yeah. Sorry, it's like I don't have to watch it with that sort of mindset to sort of like try to unravel the mystery of the movie. I can totally turn my brain off and watch Citizen Kane. It's the kind of movie that back in the day, when you watched network television, you could catch Citizen Kane in the middle of the movie, which is a thing I did when I was like 16 or something, after I'd already seen it on DVD, and just be in the middle of the film and just watch it through to completion at that point because it's so fun to watch, a la an Independence Day or other kind of movie that was a typical movie you'd see in that format. And that's the thing that I love about Citizen Kane, is that it's got all that depth and richness to its production and its like construction as a film and the message and the ideas within there. But the viewing experience is as fun as any other random popular movie you might grab off the book or the movie DVD shelf.
Yes. And I think this is something that is shared by basically all of Orson Welles' films.
Yes.
You know, if you go through, like, F for Fake is both a really deep, rich deconstruction of what a documentary is and a question of what is truth and why do we want it and what do we look for in it. And it is also a fucking rip-roaring good time that will end with you howling with laughter at the prank he pulls on you at the end of the movie, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is true of a lot of his work in between. He was both a populist and a fucking genius. And I think part of that comes from his hero, and the person he interpreted most was Shakespeare, who also is easy to forget that Shakespeare is not homework. Shakespeare was written to be popular plays at this popular theater that lots of people from all walks of life went and watched, right? And I think Orson Welles had that same kind of ambition. And it is different than other movies that have been called the number one. Like, Vertigo is more homework than this is. Mm-hmm. Vertigo is more into its psychoanalysis bullshit. The most recent Sight and Sound poll winner is Chantal Akerman's Jean Dielman, which is a 4-hour experimental movie watching a woman in her apartment in real time as time goes by. Great movie, but I think no one would tell you that that is a movie that you would catch halfway through on TV and go, oh, you know what? I want to watch the rest of Jean Dielman. And I'm not putting the movie down. Every movie has a different purpose, and that doesn't make one better than the other. This is why it's stupid to do the greatest movie of all time thing, right? They have very different... Like, Jean Dielman has just a different purpose in the world than Citizen Kane did. And one is not better or lesser or whatever than the other. But I think you're right. And part of it is that the cast of this movie is so good. It's all Mercury Theater players. They were at the time all unknowns on screen. Joseph Cotten was the big breakthrough who like really made it big in Hollywood. And Joseph Cotten is like maybe my favorite actor of this period in Hollywood. He's so good. If you don't know him from other things, I mean, he's one of the main characters in Magnificent Amberson. So he worked with Wells again. He's in my favorite Hitchcock, which is Shadow of a Doubt. He's the villain. And that is one of the great Hollywood villain performances. And lots of other stuff. Joseph Cotten is just amazing. But everyone in this movie is so entertaining. They're all having to do very theatrical work in so much as they're playing characters at all ages of life. They're having to do a lot of makeup and prosthetics work, a lot of voice work. And they're up to it because this is a team of theater and radio players who really knew what they were doing. Absolutely. And, you know, when we're talking about the narrative form, as innovative as Kane was, and as influential as it has proven, because I made this point with my students, who a lot of them said Pulp Fiction was one of their favorite movies. There's no Quentin Tarantino without Citizen Kane. There's no Pulp Fiction without Citizen Kane. That's Citizen Kane broke the mold of how you do this kind of thing. But here's the thing. There is no other movie structured quite like Citizen Kane, even ones that are influenced by it, because it's weird in how it is structured. And I say this in a good way. It is like truly interesting in what it does, because one of my favorite things to focus on with this movie is that it has 3 introductory sequences. It starts with basically a little avant-garde expressionistic short film that is basically Wells doing a universal horror movie without a monster, where you go into this big gothic castle. If someone showed you this and you didn't know what Citizen Kane was, you would assume this was like a Universal monster movie because of how it goes into this very shadowy castle. There's a dying man. There's these shots through the snow globe that look like they could be out of an Ingmar Bergman movie. And it's very expressionistic. And then it hard cuts and does like a full 10-minute newsreel, completely different mode of filmmaking. I said to my students, this would be akin to like the movie Tropic Thunder by Ben Stiller opens with fake trailers. That's what Citizen Kane is doing with its newsreel. It's something that when you went to see Citizen Kane, you probably saw a newsreel, right?
Yeah.
And then it does a fake one. And it does that for 10 minutes, and it tells you everything everything that happens in Citizen Kane that is of dramatic note, everything you could put on a Wikipedia summary of Citizen Kane is outlined to you in that newsreel. And then you have the journalists in this shadowy room where you have our main journalist character whose face you never see in sunlight, at least. And you have this debate about it. And then, like, what is Rosebud? And then we get into the story. And even then it's delayed because the fourth sequence is him going to interview Susan Alexander, who doesn't talk to him. And only then in the fifth sequence, when he goes to interview a dead guy and reads the book in this big Gothic expressionistic library room, then you actually start digging into the story. And there are so many layers to that, it shouldn't work when you just explain it that way. But it's brilliant, in part because Welles knew full well this is a story structure that no one has used on film before. We're going to have to do some work to get the people invested in it. But I think to this day it matters. I think to this day that is something that is important for, like, selling students on the movie, for instance, is that it doesn't throw you in the deep end with it. It gives you a lot of pieces to start working with before the puzzle starts being assembled.
Absolutely. And I think that's, like, the thing that's fascinating is every time I sat down to watch the movie, in my head, like, I'm not, like, consciously thinking of this, but my expectation is you get the, like, Rosebud and the snow globe falls and breaks, and then shortly after that you are in Colorado in this little, like, ranch with him outside playing in the snow, when his parents are talking to the banker dude, and all that, right? Like, in my head, that's the beginning of the movie, is him as the little boy, but it's like 15 or 20 minutes into the movie before you actually get to that point. And it is so fascinating how, like, the movie lives in your memory, I think, in a different way than you sit down to watch it. Even if you've watched it over and over and over again, I think it kind of plays this trick on you by having the super layered introduction as you're, like, trying to probe slowly into the heart of what this actual story is. And it's like the movie is resistant to that. It is giving you resistance to that you, through the sort of avatar of the reporter that you're looking through the movie in, to, like, he is trying to dig into that, and slowly it gives way, and slowly you get access to it, and then from there you're trying to construct and put together all these different pieces. But as you say, it has laid out those pieces for you. It's like, from a high school teacher's perspective, it is effectively front loaded, is what we use the term for. Like, you front load the vocabulary. You give your students the list, like, here's some of the major vocabulary terms we're going to see in this reading. Let's look at these and like, think about this a little bit. And now let's read this article. And because you've had some of this material, like the background information and or vocabulary has been front loaded for you, and you've chewed on that a little bit, it gives you the sort of intellectual tools to be able to dissect and analyze the meat of what has been presented to you in the article. Whereas if you didn't have that, you would basically slip off the article. You wouldn't be able to find, like, intellectual purchase into it in order to actually dig into the ideas. And that's what the movie is doing at the beginning. It is giving you, through these different introductory sequences, this array of material that you are subconsciously absorbing, so that way once you get into the actual heart and difficult and, like, rich material of the film, you've got everything you need to be able to process and understand it.
The other metaphor you could use here, because the movie loves its jigsaw puzzle metaphor near the end with Susan Alexander, and then it's in the final monologue is the puzzle thing, is that it shows you the picture on the box at the beginning. That's what the newsreel is the picture on the box. Because in a literal sense, there's nothing missing from that newsreel. This is where he was born. This is how he made his fortune. This was his success. This was his failure. Here's where his wife and kid left him and died. Here's his second wife. Here's Xanadu. And then he died. And, like, you will not learn anything more in a strict narrative sense than that. But you will learn so much more in terms of actual character detail and thematic work and picking apart the difficult questions that lay beneath the surface of that top-level summary. Like, one of the other things I've been encouraging my students to think about is the difference between form and content in a film, which is to say, a lot of people, when they talk about film, and I understand, if it's not something you've thought about critically, just want to kind of talk about the story of the movie, right? And, like, what happened. And that's not what film studies is, because if that's what film studies is, we wouldn't have to watch the movies. We could read the Wikipedia summaries. If you just want to go with, like, well, what happened in the movie, I'm more concerned with how did it happen? What is the form with which the story was told, right? And Citizen Kane is kind of a literal treatise on this, because it starts with the whole plot, here it is. Now let's figure out why it matters, and we will use incredibly sophisticated formal techniques to do that all throughout the movie, both narratively and how the narrative is laid out, but then also in the giant array of cinematic innovations that the movie has in terms of, you know, deep focus and long takes and chiaroscuro lighting and all of that kind of stuff to illustrate why this person's life matters and the thorny questions it raises and the way we both do and don't get answers at the same time. In that the denouement of this movie, I think, is brilliant because it both satisfies you on one level and leaves you completely unsatisfied on another.
Yeah, and in one like comparison, you mentioned that one of his sort of like icons was Shakespeare. This is exactly how Romeo and Juliet is constructed.
Yeah.
Romeo and Juliet begins with a prologue, which is a sonnet that tells you the fundamentals of what the plot are. That you've got these two kids, Romeo and Juliet, that are from two warring families in Verona. And they are star-crossed lovers. They meet, but because they fall in love, they both die, and through their death, they mend the feud between the two families. Like, that is what that prologue tells you. And obviously there's a lot of details of specific things that are going to go on in the story, but there's no shock in a sort of like technical sense to the reader or the viewer, in that case for a play, at the end when Romeo and Juliet die, because you know they're going to die. But because you have gone on the journey to see how that happens, you've built the affection to the characters and you've like lived in that world with them, even if you technically know they're going to die, you still feel the impact of their death very potently, assuming it is a good production of Romeo and Juliet that you're watching. And I think it's the same thing here with Citizen Kane, that you know all the like basic details of the man's life, but knowing those details and experiencing those details through the artistry of the film are two very, very different things. And in some ways, knowing the details ahead of time gives you like a freer mental load to engage with that material. It's like one of those things of where people who are so spoiler phobic, I think oftentimes discredit the value of an experience of engaging with a piece of media when you know what's going to happen in it. Not to say that there's no value in engaging stuff where you don't know what's going to go on, but if you know the major elements before you watch a thing and engage with it, you're not distracted by what are those developments of the plot. You're not distracted with like, was that plot twist exciting? You're more interested in how do the individual pieces work? Like, how does the sort of heart of this thing function? And you're not being just swayed by the sort of like gut first reaction to whatever it is, which is one of the reasons why in like things with TV and stuff where you have people who are so emotionally invested in something, they will have like a wildly powerful response to something on just a raw plot level, but they have not actually processed the meat of what the thing is. Like, this is, I think, what happened to the TV show Lost, is that they just like rejected it at a certain point because they were not able to engage with the meat of what the story was doing because they were so focused on what is that top level plot thing that this is going on with this story and how does that resolve? And if that is not an open question, your mind is free to engage with the much like richer pastures of what this thing is trying to tell you.
Totally. And Citizen Kane, the first thing that happens is he's dead, right?
Yeah.
Like he is no longer a present tense concern. We are only solely viewing him through the past tense. He is gone from this earth. In a literal sense, it's a movie, so he never existed. But also, we are only looking at him through the lens of memory and recollection. There's no point in this movie where we are in Charles Foster Kane's subjectivity. Like, that's another thing that, like, is... Even if you know the plot structure is easy to forget, that it's very rigid on that. That you get a sense of how he feels in different scenes, but it's never his memories. It's never his point of view strictly. It's never him alone. It's him through the lens of other people. I point this out, again, I'm going to be talking a lot about school because here's the thing. I could do an intro to film course where we just watch Citizen Kane for 15 weeks in a row because it works for every possible topic other than like specialized ones. Like I'm going to do a week on animation. Citizen Kane is not an animated movie. Couldn't show it for that. But for like everything else, for mise-en-scène and cinematography and editing and sound design and all those other great things, you could teach it for. And one of the things I've been instilling in my students also is like, who's narrating? What is our subjectivity? What is the point of view of the story? And it's something that is tricky to talk about in film, because in a book, it's usually pretty literal. When you're reading literature and it's an I voice, you know it is narrated in the first person. Or you can pretty easily tell if it is, third person limited versus third person omniscient, because it's words and those are a little more concrete on the page. In film, there's only a handful of movies in film history that have been shot in the first person, but all movies are usually pretty subjective, right? And Citizen Kane also helps us with this, not just because people are narrating, but because it does encourage you to, because of the layers of narration before we get to seeing Kane at all, that we are only seeing him through that lens. One of the other things I've been telling my students is focus on the beginning of the movie. What is the establishing shot? What is the first thing we see in a movie? What is our opening visual thesis? Well, the first shot of Citizen Kane is the no trespassing sign. And, it's not subtle. And it is a story about someone who did not want to be trespassed upon, but we're going to spend 2 hours digging into him anyway. What does that put us? What mode does that put us in? The movie does such a good job making you into an investigative journalist before you ever see Orson Welles in the movie,
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. It is that, that like, like you said, this, like, it's not subtle, because that's one of the things I love about Citizen Kane. For like those big things, it's not trying to be subtle.
No.
It's not, that's one of the reasons why I sometimes laugh at it's the best movie ever made, in that sort of very stuffy reputation that comes with, is because it's like, it's not trying to hide the main ideas. Like Rosebud is a very like blatant, in-your-face, forthright metaphor that it is like impossible for any intelligent viewer of the movie to misunderstand that central idea or to have missed it. Like, it's just, you can't do it. It's so in your face. And then, you just have like, you've multiple times referenced the jigsaw puzzle thing. Like, that is such a blatant, like, I'm just telling the viewer, this is what all this was, right? This was one big jigsaw puzzle. I'm not leaving it as a sort of visual symbol metaphor that's in some shots of the movie. I'm going to have characters stand here and explain it to you. And this is a mode that a lot of older Hollywood films will do that I actually really like and miss. I think there is like an overvaluing of subtlety sometimes in modern fiction, that people want everything to be super subtle. And subtlety has its place. There is a huge amount of subtlety in the heart of Citizen Kane, but the things that it doesn't want to be subtle about, it's not subtle about. And it reminds me of, my favorite example of this is the ending of Metropolis, where it just gives you a title card that is the most blatant. This is the thesis of the movie. There is the mind and the hand, and between them must exist the heart. And you've got the main character of the movie, and he's got the guy who represents the business, and you've got the guy who represents the workers, and he's holding them and having them shake hands. And it's like, it's the most, we're just going to tell you what this movie was about on a basic level. And I like that. I like that there's no trying to hide it. There's no you're not being shy about the fact that there's some sort of moral compass to this movie's sort of ideas. But that, again, I think that doesn't mean that it can't also have so much richness that is more subtle, that allows you to dig in. In fact, I think it gives you this range of ways to engage with the movie. One of them is very simple. Even if it has, I do think, have rich ideas of what that theme is, it's a simple theme that can be expressed simply, and it will do that for you. But then it will also have all these other things that you can engage with. And that's just the thing about Citizen Kane and other movies of its generation that I very much appreciate, that I think we have lost in a lot of modern storytelling.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's Orson Welles, I think, over time developed this weird reputation as like an art house filmmaker, which he wasn't. He was a populist, totally. I mean, the Mercury Theater was not it's avant-garde in some ways because it was new, but he was not trying to like play in a little black box to 20 people. He wanted to change the world. The Mercury Theater on the Air, these were massively popular. Like the part of the legend of Citizen Kane is that he was so popular, so young. Hollywood wanted him so badly that RKO basically backed up a fire hose of money to his house and said, you can do anything. We will give you, and he was the first director in Hollywood who got this just complete, no, you have final cut. We won't look at any of the footage. You can do whatever you want. And that's how he got to make Citizen Kane. And it's not because they saw him just as this like pure artistic genius, which he was. It's also because he made he made radio plays that shocked the nation or had everybody talking the next day. War of the Worlds is the famous one, but he had other ones as well. His radio work is very easy to find now because it's on platforms like Spotify and Apple Music just out there for you. Wells had a very unlucky run of it after Citizen Kane, which is part of the tragedy. And he became kind of, I think, the patron saint of independent filmmakers because of how much he had to fucking scrimp and scramp and save to make anything after that point. The famous story of how he got the fur jacket for Othello, where he had a different movie where he made them give him a nice fur jacket, and they didn't know why, because the fur jacket never showed up on screen, and then a few years later they saw it on screen in Othello because he didn't have the money for a fur jacket, but he could get a different movie to make one for him. That's the kind of filmmaker he had to become, but not out of an ambition to play in a museum, if that makes sense. And I'm not saying that to denigrate museums or anything, but that, again, his goal was not to be insular. And I think that's part of why I think so many filmmakers and film people love him now, is because, man, he fought for his art, but he wasn't fighting for his art in a sense of like being insular. It was wanting to share this stuff with the world. And I think you see that in Kane as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of the things about this movie that's so endearing is that it's not trying to be coy with some of those fundamental ideas.
Yes, absolutely. Man, one of my favorite movies screening it this time for my students, Sean, is one of the big contrasts the movie sets up is in an early scene where he is talking with the Joseph Cotten character. He, in kind of a sober moment, Kane types up his declaration of principles for the newspaper of what he wants the newspaper to be. And this is after he's gone through kind of a period of trying to figure out what he wants to do as a newspaper, but he's decided to commit himself to real news. And they type up this declaration of principles, and Joseph Cotten says, "Can you give me the original when you're done typing it up? Because I want to save this." And at the other end of the movie, you have their big kind of falling out where Kane types up his whole review for Susan Alexander and all that stuff. And then he's sent in the mail the notice of principles, and he opens it up and he kind of pulls it out, and Susan is trying to talk to him and he sees it and she says, like, "What is that?" And he says nothing and throws it in the fire. Well, when he opened it up and pulled it out and you kind of, the camera shows you what it is, one of my students behind me went, "Oh!" Like, "Oh my God, it's the Declaration of Principles," and kind of just viscerally got it, what the movie is doing, that it is drawing this direct line across time. And it also is a moment, I think, for a lot of people where the theme of the movie snaps into place that this is a movie about watching the degradation of a man's soul, the hollowing out of someone who has goodness and worth and intelligence in them into fucking nothingness. And I think this movie is, like, entertaining. I also find it tremendously depressing because of that. Like, it is a grind to the end of watching this guy just carve out parts of himself. But, like, that is a moment, and again, not subtle, but that is like the best reaction I can possibly ask for when I'm showing a movie to freshmen and film students, is when the Declaration of Principles comes out, because this movie is 90 years old and it is working.
Yeah, and it's something where it's a tragic story of this guy.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why I love, or one of the things about the structure of the movie that's very effective, is that first sequence of flashbacks you get when he goes to the banker guy's like vault. Thatcher. You go to his like vault with the ridiculously giant book, and he can only read pages whatever to whatever that involve Charles Foster Kane. And you get that. One of like those are the only flashbacks that are really giving you like a broad look at his overall life, because you get little episodes from different points in his life. And then the other ones are going like more or less in chronological order as you're then going through the story. But that first set of ones with Thatcher, you've got one of the little scenes that is when he is older. So this is probably around the time that, all this other stuff with Susan Alexander would be going on. And he's maybe ripped up his Declaration of Principles. but it's him and Bernstein and Thatcher, and it's during the Depression, and he is basically having to like lease out the newspapers to Thatcher's bank, and they're having this kind of conversation back and forth, and you get this whole moment of self-reflection from Kane that the first time you're watching the movie, you haven't experienced his journey to get to this moment of self-reflection and to see how tragic it is that he kind of knows what's going on, but he has no power or impetus to like change what is happening to him. But where he says, you know, if I had not been born with so much money, I may have been a truly great man, you know, and Thatcher says, don't you think you were? And he goes, I think I did the best under the circumstances. Well, what would you like to be? And then there's this pregnant pause, and he looks Thatcher in the eye and says, everything you hate. And that is like such a powerful moment where you get that early on. And so you still see this spark of this idealist of who he was in those like really early scenes where he's just starting up the newspaper and Thatcher's coming in and telling him that he's losing $1 million a year. And if he loses $1 million next year and the next year, and at that rate, he'll have to shut down the business in 60 years or whatever he says. It's a great line.
Yes.
You get all that idealist young Citizen Kane there, or Charles Foster Kane there, juxtaposed with that glimmer is still in him in this brief moment when he's older. And then you follow this path of how he gets there and then goes beyond that point. And that moment of him getting the Declaration of Principles and ripping it up is one of those where you see like the chickens having come home to roost. And you know, on multiple viewings, you know that there is still dimensions to this dude. That at some point in here was that scene during the Great Depression. He has some self-awareness. He has some of these other positive qualities are still there, but he is slowly losing control of all of that and kind of giving away to corruption and this like egotistical selfishness that he is not disguising with any of the kind of philanthropy he did early on in his younger days. And that's just one of those pieces of the structure of the movie I love so much, is how that Thatcher part gives you all these other like deep insights that are kind of fragmented across time, and then you start slowly putting together all the little pieces bit by bit more chronologically through the other POVs the movie gives you.
Yes. And I think on that point, Sean, just to dive into the tragedy of it, I think among other superlatives you could give Citizen Kane, I think it is the great cinematic text, maybe one of two. I could have another one I could mention, on how money corrupts. Mm-hmm. And like, not in the kind of like platitude way that we say that, but in the deep, abiding way that I think as I've gotten older, I have found to believe in very deeply. That I think at a certain point, there's an amount of money that is just genuinely corrosive to the soul, and from which no one or precious few people, if any, could escape. And I think like we have this whole oligarch class in America now, very literally, and we have a billionaire president, and we have a billionaire fucking co-president unelected, and all this shit, and we have, you know, all of this shit. And I don't think it's necessarily that every one of those people was born out of the womb evil, right? Mm-hmm. But I do, and a lot of them, you know, came up in life with certain talents that could have benefited the world in a lot of different ways, you know? But I do think money is something that if you have enough of it, and if you do not have to work for things, and if you can get anything you want, and if there is no limiting principle to what you are, there is something about the worst that comes out in people. And we have seen that over and over again. I think Elon Musk in the United States is probably the most obvious example of someone whose brain has just been completely and totally pickled by the amount of money and privilege he has. And I think he was probably always a pretty noxious, terrible fucking piece of shit. I mean, he is someone whose fortune comes out of literal apartheid South Africa. It's a little different for him. But I do think like there's just a very obvious example of, oh, this person doesn't know what it means to be human. He cannot literally perceive the value of human life, of human labor, of anything that we as human beings will recognize. He is not human anymore. He has lost his essential humanity through wealth and privilege. And I think Citizen Kane is like a wrenching version of that story, in part because Orson Welles is a charismatic human being in a way most of these rich fucks are not. Uh-huh. and so you feel a sense of tragedy to it, but also in that it, I think, just kind of goes through the motions so beautifully, in part because of that time arrangement that you were talking about, Sean, of showing how these things just get hollowed out with time, where when you have the ability to build Xanadu and lock yourself up in there, and you have no more kingdoms left to conquer, there's just the humanity leaves you. And I think that's something I find so haunting about Citizen Kane, is how you can start with someone who has a lot of humanity inside him. And, if you want to ask me, what do I see in Rosebud? Like, it's literally a lost childhood, but it is also the path where, like, you could feel joy in things, where you could experience things with other people, where you could have love. And the way, like, the money that was foisted upon him, in its eventuality, just hollowed that out of him. It just scooped it right out.
Yeah, and it at the age of like 7 or 8 years old, it robbed him of his family, right? Like, he no longer has a mother and father that is with him anymore. He's being raised by a fucking banker, like the most miserable motherfucker. Like, basically, he's being raised by Ebenezer Scrooge pre-Christmas Carol, and it's, he's like slowly sort of drained of all these things. He has his little group of kind of buddies from college, but then you slowly see how those like buddies are really lackeys, and that like one of them, Bernstein, is fine to be Mr. Kane's lackey, and Jedediah Leland is not, right? The Joseph Cotton character is not going to be that, and that eventually that drives an impossible wedge between them. And you also just see it in like I think like the most clear moment in the movie where you see this transformation that you're talking about is the sequence where you see him with his first wife, and it's that montage at the dinner table where at first it starts very jovial and they're so in love with each other, and then every time it reiterates the scene, he gets meaner and colder and more aloof as he's more obsessed with like the intricate details of what is going on here and how people perceive him in his paper, culminating in another moment that is not trying to be subtle in the slightest, where he says something to the effect of like, they will think what I tell them to think, right? He just snaps back at his wife with that line. And you just see the way in which those sparks of brilliance he had when he was a younger guy have all fallen away, and all that's left are the negative parts that were there when he was younger, because he is still, he has his whole declarations of principles about the news, and he will only tell people like the honest news, and he will also be a champion for the rights of the working people, is what the Declaration of Principles is. It's just 2 principles. But at the same time, he is also pursuing yellow journalism. He's trying to get like these sort of like very minor sensational stories and to build them up, and effectively invent stories like the Spanish-American War. And obviously this is all based on like William Randolph Hearst and like certain like clear historical parallels here of like what was actually happening with yellow journalism at the time in the 1920s and 30s. But it's like there is a point at which he clearly is going so far beyond what the scope of those Declaration of Principles actually are involved in, and his desire to make a name for himself and to change the world has so far gone beyond his ability to actually affect those things, and all he is doing is using money to force those changes through. And that's one of the places where even when he is young and brilliant and funny and affable and charismatic, he is still falling prey to these destructive influences of money because he has access to it. Where if he had to learn the fundamentals of being a journalist and come up through that system, there is a lot of value he could have developed through that. And he doesn't, because he just skips every single step along the way to being the guy who runs every newspaper in New York.
Exactly. And I mean, that whole arc of going from earnestly wanting a paper that will do good and empowering other talented journalists to go do good work, right? Which he does at the beginning, to by the end, his papers are just purely a propaganda outlet for him and his ego. First, his campaign. I mean, that moment when they have the 2 papers of Kane wins and fraud at the polls. I mean, you could feel in the room the, this movie was prescient, wasn't it? Oh my God. So you have that, which is not subtle and it's very funny, but also like, oh my God, in 2025, does that play different? So you have that. And then once he has no political ambitions, it just becomes his Susan Alexander project, and that's all the papers are good for, and there's nothing else. And like, one, the movie is a student of history, so it's looking at things like William Randolph Hearst and these arcs, but by being a student of history, it is prescient. Because we've seen this We're grappling with this right now. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, bought the Washington Post basically as a vanity thing of it would be not to make money. He never expected to make money off the Washington Post, or the kind of money that Jeff Bezos would notice, at least, right? And so he bought it because it looks good, it looks prestigious to be running a respected newspaper that people care about. And so because of that, in the first Trump administration, the motto of the Washington Post was "Democracy dies in darkness." And Bezos didn't really interfere with the paper and empowered them to do their work because that was seen as socially admirable and acceptable. We're at Trump 2 now, and they've scrubbed that "Democracy dies in darkness" thing, and they're basically going full Fox News over there because eventually all those other things kind of float away when it is, well, this is frustrating. The slow work of gaining social prestige is frustrating. I could just go up to Daddy Trump and kiss his feet and get everything I ever wanted. That would be nice. And that is the path these people walk. That is the hollowing out of the soul. When you have the ability to go from point A to point Z and never experience B, C, D, and everything else along the way, eventually you will give in to that temptation. And that is part of the story of Charles Foster Kane, too.
Absolutely. And it's where you just get, there's a couple of moments where he does it, but where Leland is like sort of, one friend who actually is willing to say what's up to...
The Joseph Cotton character,
Yes, the Joseph Cotton character, to say what's up to Kane, right? There's that moment where he gets drunk after the election falls apart, and he just like takes into task about that underneath it all he's doing is trying to get people to like him and to like worship him effectively. And it's like his ability to connect to people has been so warped because it always must be through the prism of his wealth and his power and his privilege, a wealth and power and privilege which he did nothing to earn, right? So it's just a thing that has been given to him and he can't do anything about it. It just is there. And so it has so corrupted all those abilities to connect with people. And that I think it is both like, very damning of Kane, but it's also just incredibly sad because you do see that there is like this dude that wants this legitimate human connection. And he obviously gets one temporarily with Susan Alexander, that he finds something that's like a simple, that is just like a person that doesn't know who he is and how rare that is. And even then, he can't help but destroy it to wield his tremendous wealth to try to make her into something that she is not, because of what her dream is. He wants her to be able to fulfill her dream because he is a man who has no real dreams of his own. And there's just something really, really deeply sad about seeing all of that happen in the second half of the movie.
Should we talk about the Donald Trump of it all?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, because here's I watched this 2 days after the inauguration, so this was on my mind. Mm-hmm. It's on all our minds right now, for good or for worse, or good or for ill, or however you view it. If for some reason you view all this Trump stuff as good, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast, but yeah, welcome. Educate yourself, please. Anyway, it's also inescapable because Donald Trump has said this is his favorite movie, and that is wild. That is like a level of cognitive dissonance that like both fully explains who Donald Trump is, but is also like wild to consider that could be the case. But this is a movie about that kind of person. That is it. And I think in the past I've resisted that reading because Charles Foster Kane is intelligent and he is erudite and he is funny and he is genuinely charming in some ways because Orson Welles was all of those things and Orson Welles played him. And Donald Trump is in every way a person can be ugly, I think. But it is that story. It completely is. And like I found this movie watching it this time so immensely clarifying, and it's clarifying in multiple ways. Like the fact that I think when I was younger, I saw Kane's big speech in his political campaign about taking down boss Jim Geddes as something kind of maybe aspirational, because like, yeah, look at him sticking it to the political machine. And I find that scene horrifying now, because that's pure demagoguery, what he's doing there. Mm-hmm. He's promising to prosecute his political opponents. He's standing around bragging about his polls and how it's inevitable that he's going to win. The Trump parallels there are completely haunting. And it is also haunting in the fact that when I was younger, I could watch this and see Kane as I could see that whole sequence as a tragedy because, maybe Kane would have been a good politician.
Right.
I'm susceptible to it too. None of us are immune to that, right? None of us are immune to the demagogue who says the things maybe we want to hear. And we have to be on the lookout for that. And so I find that scene clarifying for that reason. But also just the fact that I think the psychological diagnosis this movie has, not just the money corrupting side of it, but the fact that Kane is someone who, as Leland says, desperately wants to be loved. He wants the kind of love that other people have, that is like pure and uncomplicated, and he cannot, because of his position in the world, and I think because of some of the things about his personality, he cannot have it. And if you can't have it, then the next best thing is to force it and force reality to bend around your will. That's what it means to run for office. That's what it means to print the paper that says fraud at the polls. That's what it means to put up Susan Alexander as your big vanity project and force your papers to reorient as a propaganda arm of that, is to try to force this thing in there. But it is ultimately hollow because at best, that is the sugar replacement version of love, right? And it will never actually fulfill you. And like, yeah, that seems like a pretty good description of who Donald Trump is as a human being, of someone who is just chemically incapable of feeling or receiving affection. And so, you know what? Maybe I fucking bend the people to my will. And that is the arc of that guy's fucking life. And it is fucking pathetic and sad.
Yeah, and I think if like there's any big thing that differentiates Kane and Trump, it's just like the kind of world they live in. Where I think a lot of like the suave charm, like it's there because obviously the character's written that way and Orson Welles is playing it that way. But I do also think that there is a truth to that this sort of new money industrial tycoon that rises up in like the late 19th century into the early 20th century, that they do have more charm and charisma, partially because they have a sort of like worldly education that someone like a Trump lacks, right? Like in the movie, you basically know that Kane has honestly like the same kind of education that Orson Welles himself had in real life, but that lots of these kind of guys did, where they toured around Europe their entire youth.
Yes.
And they were at all these prestigious academies and they learned etiquette and manners and all that kind of stuff. You're still like, you know, you're still living in a world where like the British monarchy is a fucking monarchy and not a poster child, right? So it's like you're still living in a world where those notions of etiquette and like class and aristocracy are much more like present, whereas now like that shit's so foreign. And I think like America's like sort of like pseudo aristocratic class, their oligarchy class, like that class appealed to and wanted to have that kind of social status, which came with that kind of respect. And in order to have that, you must have a front-facing, a world-facing mask of someone who is like the perfect gentleman, who is erudite and educated and knows Latin and all these things, right? And that's the world that Kane comes up in. Whereas like a Donald Trump or any of our current, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, any of these dudes, Elon Musk, like that's not the kind of world they grew up in. Like they didn't receive that kind of education. They don't need to have, nor is it expected that they exhibit those certain kind of traits for like social acceptance within a certain social strata. Instead, I think like the sort of the thuggishness being kind of barren and on the face of it is part of the appeal, because I think that's just part of like where certain social mores have shifted over the course of the 20th century. But fundamentally, Kane is a Trump. It's just he's a Trump from the 1920s, not a Trump from the 1990s to now.
No, I think you're right, Sean. And of course, one of the mistakes we make over here on the left is ignoring the fact that Trump does have charisma by today's standards. He does have a showman's sense of things. He can be funny in a way that is horrifying, but also like it's out there. If you want to see a human being who actually is devoid of charisma, that would be Elon Musk. That is someone who feels like they are a fucking pod person. Just the pod is filled with evil, and it's horrible. And you realize how much worse this can fucking get once we're past even as bad as Donald Trump is, right? But like those parallels are there, and I think you're right. You have to make the adjustments for history. Orson Welles couldn't make a movie about 2025 because he lived in the 1930s and 40s, right? But that doesn't mean it's not applicable if you make the necessary adjustments and see how history has moved. Yeah.
And there's, you know, another thing is like there is the like, one thing I love about the movie that I always forget this happens is there is the background of World War II, of course, and like Nazis in Germany. I always forget that in the reel, there's like a whole Forrest Gump thing that happens, you know, where Kane is with all the important political figures of the day, whom like Orson Welles had met all those guys too, because again, like there's a lot of, Orson Welles in Charles Foster Kane, like that is not an original observation, but there's a lot of that sort of like childhood is very similar, but you do have that one shot in the newsreel of him waving with Hitler, or I assume that's like an actor dressed like Hitler. I'm not sure what they did for that. But I love that, and the guy in the narrator says like, he's met like the greatest figures of history whom he supported and denounced, sometimes supported and later denounced. And then they show Hitler. But that is obviously another kind of piece here, is the growing fascism in World War II for the historical context in which the movie was originally made, that I think is there, of the sort of that sense of a historical period where people were using tremendous power to corrupt and erode at democracies in order to force their will and their kind of vanity on the rest of the world.
Yes, I'm actually looking up on his Wikipedia page. Welles did claim to have met Hitler once in when he was hiking in Austria with a teacher who turned out to be a budding Nazi. Welles said that Hitler made no impression on him and that he could not remember anything of him from the encounter. He said that he had no personality at all. Quote, he was invisible. There was nothing there until there were about 5,000 people yelling Sieg Heil. Damn. That was one of his many appearances on the Dick Cavett show.
Yes.
Which, oh man, Welles on the Dick Cavett show is genuinely one of the best pieces of the Welles filmography.
Yeah, like someone
All
should
those
just
appearances.
Edit together a movie that's just every interview Orson Welles ever gave and just put that in movie theaters. It'd be one like the best movies of the year.
Yes, absolutely. Because that's also like a subtle but devastating slam on Adolf there. Yes. I fucking love it. And true. I think very true. Someone who's empty until they get enough of a following to try to make them feel full inside. It sucks. Yeah, so I just think all of that, it is, I think, a movie that is perpetually clarifying about the moments we live in, because the social conditions this movie is interested in just have not gone away.
Yeah.
Maybe, and I do wonder if like the periods where Citizen Kane was held up as like the best of the best, and I think maybe it got that stuffy reputation, do kind of coincide with periods in like world history where maybe it felt less relevant, like the 80s and 90s, like the final times that it was voted number one on the Sight and Sound poll. Like the last time would have been 2002, right before the Iraq War. I think like Citizen Kane reemerges in some ways as relevant in the 21st century, in the like, particularly in America and the path we've been on since like W. Bush, arguably since Reagan, although, there's differences of kind there, obviously, with where we are now. It's a movie that I think history has come back around to. Worse for history, better for Citizen Kane.
Yes, but yeah, I think part of it is like a lot of what this movie is talking about is sort of, comes along with that sort of historical swing towards fascism, which obviously we are like really deep into and have been for a while at this point, not just in America, but all around the world. And a lot of these themes exist alongside that. It's no mistake, again, that this came out in 1941. Like, it is very interested in those ideas, even if, I don't think the movie is saying that Charles Foster Kane himself is explicitly a fascist, though in the movie reel they do have the thing where they say, like, condemned as a fascist, condemned as a communist, right? That, like, everybody on every political side has said everything there is to be said about Charles Foster Kane. But like, I do think that those general ideas and the overall mood of the film come into that moment in a very particular way because of the moment in history in which it's made.
Yes, absolutely. Speaking of when the movie was made and its innovations, we got to talk about the cinematography for a minute here.
Oh, yes.
Because it perpetually blows my mind. I always think, like I know in the back of my head, oh yeah, it's one of the best, looking movies ever made. And then you always go back to it and I find it astonishing. I mean, this time specifically, I was watching it on, this would be the biggest screen I've seen it on since the last time I was at Colorado 10 years ago. Because this is our big auditorium and it's a big screen that we were showing it on. And we can't show 4K, but it's the Blu-ray from the Criterion set. So it's the same master, which looks very good. And, the number one thing this movie is known for in film history in a technical sense is deep focus photography. And there were a bunch of things involved in that. They wanted to be able to resolve to the depths of the image and have everything in even focus, and that is something that at the time was still very difficult. It was the availability of faster film stocks that could basically capture more light more quickly, combined with some new lenses, combined with a lot of trick photography, like the scene where Kane they're in his parents' cabin and he's playing out back with the sled and it's all in focus. That's rear projection through the window, because you couldn't actually capture a light source like that. Even today, that would probably be impossible because of the differing light from inside and outside in terms of even focus. But there's a lot of it that is just genuinely they figured it out and they got it. And there are shots that, particularly seeing it on a giant screen, I still don't understand it. I have taught this movie. I have been taught this movie. I have read about this movie. I know technically what they did. And there have been decades of movies influenced by Citizen Kane that also go for a deep focus effect. And it's something we can do much more easily now with the technology at our availability to have everything in focus into the depths of the image. And yet, I still have this feeling with some of those scenes. Like, for instance, the famous one where they're in Thatcher's. You talked about it earlier. It's one of the many scenes where they're signing contracts. And they're in his big towering office. And you have Kane, you have Bernstein in the very front of the image, almost like kind of a bird hovering over it. Then you've got Thatcher behind the desk, and then you've got Kane all the way on the other side of the room standing over by the window, and it is fully in focus all the way to the back, and you can see the minute details of Orson Welles' physical performance on his face, and I still go, I don't know how this thing exists. I don't know how they lit, and it's also seen with full chiaroscuro lighting and everything, and I don't understand on a technical level how this thing exists.
Yeah, there's the movie is just chock full of shots and moments like that. One of my favorite scenes you've talked a little bit about is the one where Leland is writing the review for Susan Alexander, and Kane decides to write it, and but he finishes it as a negative notice. I love the 1940s-ness of it, that they call them notices, not reviews. It's very charming. Right, and then you have the incredible moment of that's when Charles Kane fucking fires him with the chink of the typewriter. Just the time involved, it's great. But you have this incredible shot of Kane in the foreground and just typing, and then you see Leland come out in the background so far, and the incredible depth and distance of that room, of that main part of the office, is so rich in that sense of space and just distance between the characters. It's not a subtle visual metaphor or trick that they're playing in terms of the meaning behind it, but it is so powerful, I think, on the experience of the viewer when you just see the immense spaces that these people exist in, and that deep focus being able to resolve all of that detail just accentuates that so much. And then obviously another place where you get that a huge amount is in the ending sequences of the movie, when he's very old in his mansion, and it's Susan Alexander at the fire with her jigsaw puzzle, and Kane sitting on the other side of the room, so far away on his little couch or whatever. That sense of distance and depth to the imagery is so potent and powerful, and it's a combination of that deep focus stuff, the set design, and then also, as you're talking about, that really powerful black and white chiaroscuro lighting it adds an insane amount of richness to every single frame of the film.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so they have the deep focus. They also did crazy things like they wanted the camera so low to get these extreme low angles that not only did you mentioned this earlier in the podcast, Sean, as a joke, but it's true. They had to build roofs on the sets. Sets don't normally have roofs because you put lights up there and all sorts of stuff. So they had to build roofs, but they also had to hollow out the floor. I don't know if you've seen any of the pictures of shooting Citizen Kane, but they just had to hollow out the floor and put Greg Toland down beneath the stage to shoot up at the actors. So you have these incredible low angles as well that are so ominous, combined with all that sculptorly lighting and the deep focus. I mean, whole branches of film theory have effectively been born from these techniques. The big one is André Bazin, who is the intellectual father of the French New Wave, because he's the founder of Cahiers du Cinéma, where Truffaut and Godard and all those guys wrote and developed things like auteur theory. And I think Bazin is... my dissertation is titled after Bazin. My dissertation is called New Types, Digital Technology and the Evolution of the Language of Anime. One of Bazin's famous pieces is the evolution of the language of cinema. And in the evolution of the language of cinema, his argument is that film always wanted to reach a perfect simulacrum of reality, and that technology had to catch up to it, and that Citizen Kane was rescued by the French critics. Citizen Kane was It's not quite right to say it was ignored in the US. The people who saw it did like it. It won an Oscar for screenplay. It was buried aggressively by William Randolph Hearst and his whole machine, and it bombed. But the French critics revived it as a masterpiece and sang its praises, and Bazin was the lead champion on this, and in that piece he argues Citizen Kane represents the fulfillment of the early dream of cinema. And his two main things he says are the techniques that are key are deep focus and long takes, because a lot of Kane is shot in very long takes that play out at full length. Or sequences that have a number of just long takes that go for a while before they cut. And he says being able to observe in time and in space, which is the two things Citizen Kane masters, is the key to unlocking this Bazanian ideal of cinematic realism. Now, I would maybe argue with the idea that film's main role is for realism, and I would even maybe argue that Citizen Kane has the vessel for that, because Kane has a lot of expressive stuff in it too, where it has some sets that are very realistic and grounded, like the big scene I think of there is the campaign offices where Leland talks to him and he's drunk. That look is supposed to look grounded and realistic, and it's one of the scenes where you see the roof above them. But like Xanadu is a psychological space. I don't think it's real. It's like it is an expression of something inside Kane more than it is a representation of reality. So you could quibble with that. But Bazin's basic principle that like those are these key things that Kane unlocked, I think continues to resonate through time. I think there's still whole film movements that like those two key things of duration and distance, and being able to do all that within the film frame. And this is Bazin's other argument, is this is also basically the perfect merging of theater and film, where you're able, and of course Orson Welles is the one who figured this out, because he did all this theater stuff. And Kane is both immensely cinematic, like the kind of lighting and set design and stuff that it's doing are things you couldn't do on the stage. But it is also interested in preserving the idea of actors performing in full body, with a lot of space around them and without a lot of cutting determining where you're looking and what you're doing. And that's where a lot of the subtlety of the film comes from, is in those long scenes where you observe actors in time and in space and you make of it what you will, because of those techniques. And it is this merging of what can you do with a camera, what could you do on stage, and it is the breakthrough that Citizen Kane gives to film history.
Absolutely. And it's that like theatrical component is the part that I always find very interesting, because I like what you said of like the very full-bodied nature of the performances, particularly for Orson Welles himself, that I think is most prominently featured in that way. But you just have some of these scenes that like I feel like no other movie would shoot them this way. Like my favorite example of this, that feels so theatrical, but still, you know, obviously very cinematic at the same time, but is preserving that theatrical ideal of acting in the full and being able to sort of capture that, is near the end when Kane destroys Susan's room. And you just get this long performance of seeing Orson Welles' Kane go and just wreck this room. And there's a couple of cuts in there, but they're just long takes where you see him dominate that space, you see his full body, and you just get the complete experience of the performance. Obviously, another thing that's theatrical in that is just the sheer idea of having a 25-year-old guy playing someone who's so old and communicating that through obviously like the cosmetics, but also his physicality that he's using to play that character in that moment. And it is just such an exquisite and powerful scene in the movie where that you just get to experience it all. And it's not the kind of thing that I think a more modern film would think to put lots of cuts in a scene like that, with the logic being that like the like erraticness or chaotic nature of cutting frequently adds to the sense of the sort of verisimilitude of the chaos of him destroying the room, right? That's like how like all modern fight scenes are typically shot outside of something like a John Wick movie, off of that kind of logic. And not to say that there's no, legitimacy to that logic. I think that style can be done extremely well and it can be very effective, but there is something so powerful. And I think the theater lover in me and the Shakespeare lover in me really just adores being able to see and feel that whole moment and just take it in along with the character in real time, uninterrupted, as he explores that space and just demolishes that entire space. And it feels so powerful and visceral and physical and real because it is not being disguised or covered up in any way.
100%. But the film is also like, it also means it's very smart and judicious about when it uses more traditional cinematic techniques like the close-up. I think the close-ups in this movie fucking land like a punch because they're relatively rare in the film.
Yeah.
Like, it favors full-body acting, but then it will go in for moments of close-up. Like, I think the best close-up in the movie to me is when Kane is watching Susan Alexander perform, and he's all in darkness, but there's a strip of light across his eyes. And this is the scene where he starts clapping, and he basically is trying to will into being a standing ovation that never comes. And it is like the best visual representation of what Kane's life is this like willing a reality into being that can never come because it's something that he doesn't have. And I think that close-up, because we've already seen that sequence from a different perspective, and then we go back over it again now with Kane, and it's one of the most powerful moments of Kane's subjectivity in the movie in terms of like what is he feeling in the moment, and it is this chiaroscuro close-up. But I think all of the close-ups in the movie have that kind of punch, in part because they're relatively rare.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have like lots of great, like really creative editing and cuts that are doing like really like inventive weird things. Like this is one of my favorite sequences of the whole movie, just in terms of a filmmaking thing, is that whole part where when he's very young, he's setting up his newspaper, he goes to that like rival newspaper and sees the thing through the window of like the dozen best newsmen in the business or whatever it is, and then it does this just absolutely killer match cut to that same photograph. And then the picture gets taken, and all the while Kane is narrating about what is happening here. Like, 5 years ago, I saw this picture, blah, 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 blah. And then he steps into that frame, and it zooms, and like the camera pulls back out, and you see that now it is like he has bought all those guys for his newspaper, and they're retaking the same picture, just to spite this other newspaper. Like that shot, that match cut, and the way it's playing with time and space through that piece of editing, it's so juicy. It's so good. And it's one of those that like I think is very surprising about the movie, because you just don't expect to see that in a movie made in 1941. Like that, like the way that just like that one cut does so much. It adds so much and tells an entire little story in that moment and moves the movie forward in such an efficient way while being so visually engaging. I just think it's like one of the most impressive cuts in the whole film.
Yes, which is a tall order because there's lots, but I completely agree with you on that. Amazing. Yeah, I've often thought, like, okay, if I were to pick the best cinematography in film history, I would split it between color and black and white, obviously. I think the best color cinematography of all time is Kurosawa Akira's Ran from 85. I think that's like a pretty clear answer for me. And then as number two, I probably put one of Wong Kar-wai's movies, with Alexander Doyle, like In the Mood for Love or Chungking Express would be my number two. Also, while I was looking this up, Sean, I just learned one of the three cinematographers on Ran, Ueda Shoji, just died a few weeks ago.
No.
I didn't know that. I was like, oh my gosh, this happened like 2 weeks ago, and I didn't know. Anyway, rest in peace, Ueda Shoji. You were a genius. He also did Kagemusha. Anyway, so those are what I would do for color. For black and white, I think it is Citizen Kane and or something shot by Miyagawa Kazuo, who is the cinematographer behind Rashomon, Ugetsu, Sancho the Byleth, and Yojimbo are probably his four most famous, although he also did a ton of Zatoichi movies later in his career. And I think he was, as a DP, like basically the Greg Toland of Japan, in terms of his use of light and everything. So, and I kind of, it depends on the day of the week whether I go Rashomon, Ugetsu, Sancho, because they're all brilliant. But like I would say that class is like my pick for black and white cinematography. So yeah, my point is Citizen Kane, about as good as it gets in terms of visual design of a movie.
Yeah. And then you have, for me, like one of my favorite shots in any movie ever, that has obviously been quoted and reused a million times in a million different things, but near the end, after he destroys Susan's room and he steps out and you have the mirrored hallway on either side and he looks into the infinite depths and he just like slowly stalks across the shot. It's like, God damn, like every time the movie gets to that point, like it is such a haunting, powerful image. Again, obviously done in reference in a million things, but it's just every time the way the movie builds up to that. And when you talk about the sense of Xanadu being this sort of like expressionist or subjective space that exists in almost a kind of dream world, that is like the moment that like really cinches it. That you're just melted into this dude's subconscious at this point, that because that is the only world in which he can exist. He is so retreated out of the physical reality in which everybody else lives that all he is left with is staring into his own infinite reflection. And it's like, man, that is a fucking mic drop of a moment that is almost at the end of the movie. Like, I'm always surprised when I get there and I realize like, oh, there's only like 5 minutes left in the film once you get to that point. Like, it's so close to the end.
That's our last shot of Welles in the movie, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That is one of the many screenshots I just have. I have a folder of Kane shots that I just bring out every time I have to do a PowerPoint with Citizen Kane, and that one goes in every PowerPoint I've ever made of Citizen Kane, because it is one of the best shots in movie history. Also around there, Sean, lest we forget, we get the first jump scare in movie history.
Oh, yes.
Sometimes called, which is the cut to the rooster going, caw! And it is... Every time I get to show, this is such a fun movie to show to students, in part because that moment just freaks them the fuck out, because it's the last thing you expect in this movie. And it also means I get to show the next day the clip from the Dick Cavett show, Where Else, where Orson Welles is asked about this, and he goes, "It was so they would wake up. I was worried they'd be asleep. I put the crow in to wake them up." It's just, I love it. It's such a bizarre moment, but like no one else would have done it. I love it.
Yeah, but it is another one, like, it just makes that whole section of the movie feel so tense and, like...
Yes.
Almost like, it's, like, almost gross because of how far Kane has gone with his sort of depravity of just locking everything away, and like, it's so gothic, it's so deeply gothic that point in the movie, and, like, all the stuff with Susan Alexander, where she might as well be, like, the crazy ex-wife locked up in the attic at this point in fucking Jane Eyre. You know, and so I think having this exotic bird just screech into your ears, and then the way that it like fades that out is so strange and eerie and unlike anything else in the film. Whether it was effectively as an alarm clock or not, like whatever the intentions were behind it, it is so good at just making that space feel alien, gothic, and upsetting.
Yeah. You can never take Orson Welles too seriously in his Dick Cavett appearances, because he's always telling a joke as he relates his own personal history. But I do love it. It's one of my favorite things about teaching Welles in general is then I get to go search for Welles clips and like show his different like Japanese wine commercials or something. It's a joy. Yeah. Citizen Kane, again, cinematography. It could be my main topic for that week. Editing. It could be my main topic for that week because it is both a masterpiece of macro editing, the structure of the movie overall, and the micro shot-to-shot choices, right? Mise-en-scène, it's like mise-en-scène the movie, which mise-en-scène describes everything in a movie, but it's a masterwork of mise-en-scène, which is the arrangement of all the pieces on screen. Sound design. I think there's a lot you could do for that. It's just everything you can kind of say about movies to some degree can be said through Citizen Kane. And I think if for no other reason, that is the reason it has the stature it has and deserves that part of the stature. It is, and it's not just that it is so purely entertaining, as you say, Sean, it is also just so teachable. I feel like not just that I can teach with it, but I learn things every time I watch it. It reminds me that I always have more to learn, especially if someone figured all this out at 25, you know? There's always something to go back and get out of this movie.
Yeah, and going down the list of things you just said, well, obviously I think this is not a focus specifically for film studies in that way. In terms of the production sort of like excellence of this, it is so easy to forget that Orson Welles wasn't just the director, he also is the main actor in the film. And I always feel like because the movie's direction is so exemplary, people always kind of undersell that it is also one of the best performances in the history of movies is Orson Welles as Kane. It's like one of the best performances just in whatever kind of like framework you want to assess that. But particularly if you're thinking about the complexity of a performance, of what you're asking a 25-year-old dude to do, and how convincing he is throughout. Obviously, I think by the time you get to like the super, super old Kane at the very end of the movie, there it moves a little bit outside of reality. I think it's very effective, but I just think there's no way to make a 25-year-old dude really look like someone who's 80. But it's shocking how much, like, when he's supposed to be like middle-aged Kane in his political career, how much you're just like, yeah, that's just a guy who's like 50 years old. Like, you just completely forget. And it's really incredible how just titanic that central performance is, and how it delivers. What for me as like, you went down the film studies thing, as an English teacher, how I look at this is like Citizen Kane is one of, if not like the greatest character studies ever in terms of that form of narrative, which obviously is a very long-standing, very old form of narrative that goes back hundreds of years, well before the history of cinema itself. But especially if you're looking in terms of movies, but I think if you go outside of that sense of let's make a particular figure who's very like enigmatic, the central focus of the story, and everything is about digging at that character, which is not exactly a Shakespearean form, but I think Shakespeare kind of gave rise to it because he has a lot of characters like Falstaff, who is one of, obviously, Orson Welles' like big ones because he did the Champs of Midnight movie, are like, you have those Shakespearean characters that have so much richness and depth to them, but that are just like outside of arm's length. And so you're always kind of trying to reach to understand and grab onto them. And then you have, obviously, Hamlet would be like the big character study play by Shakespeare, which would be the other really, really big, like one of the best, if not the best character studies in the history of fiction. But like, I think Citizen Kane is there. Like, it just does everything that narrative mode aspires to do. It does it with absolute excellence, and it does it to the best that the medium in which it exists can really produce.
Well, 100%. And I completely agree about the performances. And here's the other thing you always got to remember. Every person you see in this movie, it's their first film performance. Yep. Every one of them. And that's why Orson Welles does at the end his one of my favorite credit sequences in movie history is him reading out the credits and introducing everybody. I love it to death. And I love it in his other movies too. He does it in Ambersons, and it's so good there. And in the UK cut of Othello, there are no on-screen credits. He just narrates over the first scene, and it's such a good way to introduce a movie. I don't think you could do that anymore because of union rules, and I do understand the importance of that, but also I wish you could just read the credits because it's so cool. I mean, no one has as cool a voice as Orson Welles, so it's kind of hard. But it is pretty great. And it's all these people. And you know, Welles does a lot stylistically to facilitate a theatrical form of acting in here, but you still have to remember that stage acting, radio acting, film acting are very different things.
Yes.
And being good in one never guarantees being good at another. And it speaks both to the quality of these performers, but also Welles as a director being able to create the space for everyone to put their best foot forward. And also remember that Welles was very generous with this in his films. Yes. He wanted to highlight other people's talents. His second movie, Ambersons, he's not in other than as the narrator. And he was very proud of the Mercury Theater players. And he is the star of the movie as Kane, but you can't say anyone else got like a bad role. They all got the fucking meatiest roles you could ask for in this movie. When you think of Leland or Susan Alexander or even Boss Jim Geddes in his one scene, it's everybody.
Yeah, every actor gets a meaty performance. I also love, that Orson Welles shares a title credit in the credits with Greg Toland, because obviously, that is, he would have been the first person to tell you, and you can see in like 100 interviews throughout from the 40s up until his death, where he extols the incredible talent of Greg Toland as his cameraman and cinematographer.
Greg Toland died pretty young. He died in 1948, so just 7 years after this movie. He was only 44. And Welles would say until the end of his life that Toland was the best cinematographer who ever lived. And it is tough to argue, Yeah. When you see this movie. Man. So that's Citizen Kane. This is a sliver of what we could say about it, but I feel good having got this out of my system. How about you, Sean?
I just enjoy having an excuse to watch Citizen Kane again. I watch it every few years, and it's always really good. And yes, it felt a crime that we had never actually covered. I think for me, the moment on a podcast where I realized, like, have we actually never done a Citizen Kane one, is when we were doing Batman Mask of the Phantasm. And because I think when we watched that was not that long after one of the times I'd seen Citizen Kane. I'm like, oh, this is just Citizen Kane, the Batman movie. Like, how did I never realize this is just Batman Citizen Kane? Crazy. And it's like, and we've never actually done a podcast on it. So it feels like we finally checked off, one of the podcasts that we've always needed to do.
I agree, and I'm glad we got to do it. And I'm also glad, Sean, that we're about to do a top 10 list. You want to do it?
Oh, yeah. Let's do it.